And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is September the 3rd, 246th day of the year. Only 119 days remain to the year's over with. We get to start a new year. Well, holidays and observances, it's National Skyscraper Day, Merchant Navy Day, National Welsh Rabbit Day, Indigenous Literacy Day, U.S. Bowling League Day, Global Talent Acquisition Day. You know, if people keep the world moving, talent acquisition and HR people make sure the world runs as well as possible. Crayfish Party, Festa del Vino, that of course is the wine festival. Celebrates Madeira's world famous wine. And now of course everything has to, there we go. National Childhood Injury Prevention Week, Red Valley Legacy Week, Yogurt Day, Fiesta de San Pacho, and that is celebration of Quibdo with music and dance and color. This festival honors St. Francis of Assisi, blends Catholic traditions and Afro-Colombian culture very uniquely. I've heard some interesting things about that particular celebration. Literacy and Numeracy Week, Navasard, Zero Waste Week, famous people born on this date, Charlie Sheen. Well, all that having been said, let's see what stories we got in the news for September 3rd. House committees released Epstein jail footage that, amazingly enough, contradicts the DOJ claim. A recently released congressional video fills a 1-minute gap in earlier surveillance about notorious financier Jeffrey Epstein. That's on the night of his so-called suicide. 2 key clips that part of a nearly 34,000 file drop by the House Oversight Committee that was released last night revealed a highly contested minute missing from surveillance footage filmed outside his cell block in the Metropolitan Correctional Center. This disputed minute lasted from 11:58 and 59 seconds on August 9th, 2019 to midnight on August 10th, 2019. Digital forensic experts previously found the clip released by the Department of Justice was chopped from at least 2 separate video segments and strung together using Adobe Premiere Pro, fueling conspiracy theories that the administration was covering up his death. This new drop from the House committee shows a camera date switched at about midnight, leading to a necessary binding of the 2 clips for a consecutive video. According to Fox News, combining those 2 clips after the latest release on Tuesday shows there was indeed no lapse in footage, which contradicted Attorney General Pam Bondi's previous explanation that the last minute of footage was deleted every night. Apparently that did not happen. Now, it's unclear why the footage disappeared, though the minute that was missing from the original drop didn't reveal any action inside the cell block. The DOJ determined that he committed suicide inside its New York City jail cell while awaiting further sex trafficking charges. Attorney General's office couldn't be immediately reached by Fox for any comment. Well, another one of God's anointed, sitting on the appeals court, blocks President Trump from deporting members of the Trinidad gang. It's okay if they're here to commit crimes. I mean, after all, they have a right to commit crimes. At least that's the view of God's anointed. And if you wonder who God's anointed are, those are the judges who think that they have a mandate from God to make their opinions be the law. But the Federal Appeals Court ruled yesterday the Trump administration can't speed the deportation of migrants accused of being members of this Venezuelan gang using an 18th century wartime law. In a 2-1 ruling, the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals sided with immigrant rights lawyers and lower court judges who argued that the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was not created to be used against gangs like Trinidad. No, they're supposed to be used against members of the church who have offended. The Trump administration's use of this wartime statute during peacetime to regulate immigration was shut down by the court, according to Lee Gallant, who argued the case for the American Civil Liberties Union. If I had my way, I would take all these folks who argue on behalf of these criminal gangs and put them on the buses with the criminal gangs and send them south. Well, Kim Jong-un's young daughter is being groomed to lead the regime after a military parade visit in China, according to an expert. Trump advises Kim Jong-un to relax and go back to the beach. This was his first visit to China in a number of years, accompanied by his daughter, Kim Ju-ai, also thought to be a successor. That's according to South Korea's National Intelligence Service. The girl's believed to be about 12 or 13, and her debut appearance outside her home country signals a possible role as the North Korean heir-in-waiting. That's according to a parenting expert. First publicly introduced to North Korea in 2022. So we'll see if that's what happens. You know, Kim Jong-un's father actually created modern North Korea. And then when he died, gave it to his son. Well, President Trump and Speaker Leavitt, not Speaker, Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, took turns knocking CBS News Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan Friday, called her stupid and so bad. Speaking with the Daily Caller, President Trump took a victory lap over a settlement of CBS's parent company, Paramount, after accusing the company of election interference for its handling of a 60-minute interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris. He then pivoted to speculating about the future of Norah O'Donnell, who was the CBS Evening News host. She actually left it earlier this year, but remains at the network. Pay her $12 million a year, and she's not going to be there very long, Trump said to the Daily Caller, but if she's not already out, she's pretty close. Let's see what else we got. Some more details have emerged about the life of the shooter at the Minneapolis Catholic Church. A week after the crazed 23-year-old shot and killed 2 children and injured 18 more victims at a Catholic Mass in Minneapolis, details about his personal life and this meticulously planned attack by this maniac who was obsessed with the idea of killing children have begun to unravel. Robin Westman, who was born Robert Westman, committed the heinous act at the Annunciation Catholic Church the morning of August 27th before committing suicide at the scene. As a child, he attended both the school and the church, which is located next door. Now, what's happened? There we go. The months and years leading up to his heinous actions are fraught with chaos in his personal life. Court records show that Mary Grace Westman and her ex-husband, James Westman, who divorced in 2012, when Robin, who was then Robert, was 11 at the time, also had two older siblings. Custody agreement showed that Mary Grace was going to be his primary caretaker. Father was given custody every other weekend. Both parents had Minneapolis addresses until 2021. Citing police records, NBC reported that local police responded to a criminal offense at the suburban Westman home. But of course, further details were scant. The case was eventually closed. 2 years later, police in Eagan, Minnesota were called to the home, this time for an incident described only as a mental health issue. Unclear who the juvenile in need of the mental health check was. Well, in 2019, Robert Westman became Robin Westman. The mother signed off on the name change. Court documents show the shooter's mother applied for her son to legally change his name, writing in 2019, the minor identifies as female and wants her name to reflect the identification. Now, Minneapolis police officers confirmed the shooter's mother worked at the school where the shooting took place for several years and retired in 2021. According to a warrant, James Westman told police that Westman had recently broken up with a romantic partner. In that same warrant, the older Westman told police the shooter moved in with a friend at the St. Louis Park address that the police searched after the shooting. Neighbors speculated Westman could have moved to a new location just 2 weeks prior to the shooting. Some said he moved earlier in the summer. Well, whatever may have been his rationale, he inflicted a lot of pain and suffering on folks. Well, President Trump is driving clueless Democrats to embrace the losing side of a lot of issues, like opposing his efforts to drive down crime, favoring open borders, and encouraging biological men to compete in women's sports. Democrats are going wild about President Trump's opposition. There's another critical cause that Trump should champion and to put the Democrats even more on the defensive: failing public schools. And the time is right. Parents are unhappy with their children's schools, and AI promises huge improvements if we get the teacher unions out of the way. For some reason, the teachers' unions are unbelievably liberal, leaning terribly to the left. You know, in the upcoming days, children going back to the classroom, and a lot of families look forward with excitement to a new academic year of achievement and progress. For others, and especially those trapped in the failing schools in the Democratic-run cities like New York and Chicago, New Year's going to bring defeat and disappointment. You know, what I've heard about our schools here, things that I was expected to be able to take care of with no problem are major stumbling blocks here. Sitting here on the border as we are, a lot of kids are brought across the border from Mexico to attend El Paso schools. Well, a teen prank has turned deadly in a Democratic-run city, and a homeowner is now facing murder charges. Houston, Texas. The man is charged with murder after allegedly killing an 11-year-old child who was playing a ding-dong ditch prank. Officials in Houston said 42-year-old Gonzalo Leon Jr. was charged with murder after allegedly shooting and killing Julian Guzman, 11, on Saturday as he was running away from his home. The idea is they run up and they ring your doorbell and then they take off running. And Guzman had rang the doorbells of several homes in the area before running away. One witness told police that Guzman was running from a house after ringing the doorbell just shortly before he was shot. And Leon Jr. was detained at the scene but later released. Eventually, he was arrested by the Houston Police Department SWAT team on Tuesday and booked into the Harris County Jail. While there is a stand your ground in the castle law to protect homeowners protecting their property, the way this all went down, since the kid was running away and he wasn't a visible threat, Leon Jr. is going to be charged with murder. Well, Prince William shielded Prince George from his royal destiny for years in order to protect his childhood. He was 7 years old when he first learned about his destiny of becoming King of England. Prince William deliberately postponed that conversation with his son so Prince George could relax and enjoy school and sports and family life. That's according to a British royal expert. All leaders face judgment and criticism, but if you experience the weight of such a destiny at a young age, according to this royal expert, whose name is Fordwich, William wanted to protect his innocence, shielding George from pressure until he was mature enough to understand his destiny. And I question whether 7 years old is old enough to understand you're going to be running the whole show. Well, Amazon is going to restrict the Prime benefit starting October 1st. It's a 15-year-old invitee program that let members share shipping benefits with non-household contacts. The Amazon free shipping perk will be restricted to household members, only starting in October. They phase out the Prime invitee program. That program allowed Amazon Prime members to share their shipping benefits with people outside their household who didn't have a membership. The invitee program was launched in 2009, focused its advertising on its Prime Family program, which includes allowing members to share membership benefits with one other adult in their household. And up to 4 teens were added before April 7, 2025, and up to 4 profiles for other children. It's a very useful and enjoyable program. We've had it for years. Well, the world's largest cruise ship debuts as industry expects 19 million travelers. And the world's largest ship set sail on Sunday, making its debut out of Port Canaveral, Florida. Royal Caribbean Star of the Seas has 20 decks and 8 neighborhoods with 7 pools. Accommodates 5,000 passengers. Star of the Seas represents the next bold step in their journey to reimagine vacations, according to Royal Caribbean Group President and CEO Jason Liberty. Brings together the best of our innovation, signature experiences, the most sought-after destinations, into one unforgettable vacation. And personally, I think 5,000 people is a little much to put into one boat. Well, the Washington Post has had to issue a correction after falsely reporting Israel left Gaza as part of a 2005 peace agreement. Turned out that was false. On Sunday, the Post published a lengthy story about the Trump administration's plan to help rebuild Gaza once Israel ends its war with Hamas. And that plan includes a voluntary program for Gazans to temporarily relocate to another country in the region during reconstruction. What caught social media's attention was how the report described the decades-long dispute over the territory. Removing Palestinians from Gaza through persuasion and compensation or even force has been a subject of debate in Israel politics since Gaza was first taken from Egyptian control and occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. Israeli settlers lived alongside Palestinians until 2005 when a peace agreement mandated their departure. That's according to what the Post wrote. But there was never a peace agreement reached between Israel and the Palestinians. Critics on X flagged that era, including former Israeli government spokesman Elon Levy, who called it a whopper. He asked how this got past the editors. Well, one thing about it, if you're writing something that's anti-Israeli, editors are going to be very forgiving. Well, former Chicago police officials say Democrats are afraid a Trump crime crackdown in that city would actually work. Former head of the Chicago Police Department, Jody Weiss, called out two top Democrats in Illinois, arguing they're afraid of being humiliated by President Trump successfully bringing down crime in the city. Excuse me. After President Trump caused shockwaves with his crackdown on crime in Washington, D.C., Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson warned the president against trying to interfere in Chicago. But Trump declared in no uncertain terms, Tuesday, we're going in. I didn't say when, but we are going in. Weiss spoke to National News Desk that same day, chastising Pritzker and Johnson for opposing Trump's federal assistance efforts to combat crime. After criticizing the city's high level of black-on-black crime, Weiss lamented the governor and the mayor, said they don't want anybody to come help. So to me, when you refuse help, what you're saying is you're happy with the numbers. And that's absolutely unacceptable in Chicago right now. So it'll be interesting to see how that eventually plays out. Well, the remarkable ancient sun hat, possibly worn by a Roman soldier, was unveiled for the first time. It's a one-of-a-kind sun hat, worn by a Roman soldier in Egypt, recently unveiled, and its survival is considered miraculous. It's on display at the Bolton Museum in Greater Manchester, England. Found at the Elohun archaeological site in the Egyptian city of Fayum in 1888. It was donated to Bolton's first museum, the Chadwick Museum, in 1911. Been in storage for nearly 115 years until now. Well, according to Jesse Waters, President Trump's bringing America back to life. We're going to see how all that plays out. And a video was shown of a military strike on a suspected Venezuelan drug boat. Hopefully they did not hit the wrong boat. Well, a college student was gunned down by an ex-boyfriend after months of being stalked by him. A Michigan college student was shot to death by her ex-boyfriend over the weekend after months of reported stalking as the victim attempted to get a restraining order. Sarah Carroll, 20 years old, was killed by her ex-boyfriend, identified only as Lincoln, Saturday night at the Woodland Villa apartment, located approximately 25 miles from Detroit. The man reportedly shot her to death before calling authorities to admit to the killing. Then he turned the gun on himself and was successful in killing himself as well. Well, Carol was in the process of obtaining a restraining order against the man who had been stalking her for months. That's according to her mother. Well, as much as I'm pro-Second Amendment, some folks just don't need to have guns. We're a former news anchor, rising Republican star Ashley Hinson has announced a Senate bid in a race to succeed Iowa's Joni Ernst. Says she's running for the U.S. Senate in an appearance on a popular afternoon talk radio program in Iowa. Hinson's a former TV news anchor who's in her third term representing Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, which covers the northeastern portion of the state. And she was adamant about her support for President Trump. My screen just went dark. There we go. Well, President Trump is addressing the video that's gone viral about mysterious items being thrown out the window at the White House. The doesn't take much to get a viral sensation going on the internet. He's dismissed the video showing mystery objects being thrown from a White House window as fake. That footage appeared to show somebody repeatedly throwing objects out of the top floor of the White House onto the lawn below. He discussed it at a packed press conference. He told how the mansion's windows were sealed and bulletproof, suggested the clip was made by AI. And since the windows were definitely sealed, that would have to be the case. Well, grand jurors in Washington, D.C. have declined to indict two folks accused of threatening to kill President Trump. And in another case, a woman arrested after threatening to kill him was released by one of God's anointed. She was doing the Lord's work, going to kill President Trump. Well, Fani Willis has been ordered by a Georgia court to do another search for Trump-related records. It's Georgia State Court ordered Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis to conduct a new search for records related to her criminal case against President Donald Trump after finding that her search methods were less than adequate. Well, top GOP senator, that's Cronin, reveals he's closing the gap in a heated primary amid the opponent's alleged affair scandal. Just 6 months ago, one more time, with just 6 months to go until Texas kicks off its primary season in the 2026 midterm, the battle between longtime Republican Senator John Cronin and his GOP's challenger, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, appear to be tightening up. Paxton's a MAGA champion and longtime ally of President Trump, who's been battered over the past decade by multiple controversies. Enjoyed a comfortable double-digit lead over Cronin in polling at the beginning of the summer. That has tightened up considerably. Well, another one of God's anointed, sitting on the federal appeals court, has blocked President Trump from firing a FTC commissioner in a case testing the president's removal powers. Under the guise of explaining the law, these judges are trying to take away the president's power. In another 2-1 order, 3-judge panel agreed with the lower court that President Trump unlawfully fired FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, and her firing was squarely at odds with the Supreme Court precedent. Well, a tow truck driver has been slapped with a federal charge after hauling away an ICE vehicle. This happened August 15th, and he could get up to 10 years behind bars if he's found guilty. Bobby Nunez was allegedly laughing and filming as he towed a vehicle belonging to ICE agents, according to a federal criminal complaint obtained by Fox News. The agents were in the middle of an operation to arrest an illegal immigrant and had their emergency lights flashing as they boxed in the target's vehicle with their own to prevent her escape. Apparently, the tow truck operator thought it'd be funny to interfere with the immigration enforcement operations. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out. Well, on that note, we've ended our news segment for today. You know, we've been talking about Ghost in the Mojave, but you know, there's a lot of interesting stories that comes out of our national parks. You know, one that I've spent time in and around was Hoover Dam, which was named, of course, after President Hoover. And there's long been stories that there are bodies buried inside Hoover Dam. Supposedly people who were killed while building the dam and fell were just covered up with cement where they landed. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a crowd on top of a platform perched on the rim of Black Canyon, commemorating the building of Hoover Dam. This was September 30th, 1935, and the speech marked the dedication of a remarkable achievement. This was the completion of the tallest dam ever built, 726 feet tall. And if you've ever driven across it or driven around it, you get some idea just what a magnificent edifice it is. It's the biggest reservoir in the world and the largest hydroelectric facility in the world. And it was going to be operated at the base of the dam. Now, Hoover Dam, of course, was never without controversy, and even its name has been a point of contention. Originally, planners conceived it as the Boulder Canyon Project, renamed in 1930 to honor the sitting president who authorized it being built, former mining engineer Herbert Hoover. Unfortunately, though, like many decisions, it didn't sit well with some folks. When FDR won the 1932 election, his administration tried to wipe away all references to their one-term rival by calling it Boulder Dam. That effort never took. After memories of the Great Depression faded, Hoover would rehabilitate his post-presidency image through public service during World War II. And in 1947, Congress officially restored the name Hoover Dam. Well, the naming controversy paled in comparison with other concerns about the dam's effects. As the volume in the reservoir rose during the late 30s, the ground began to sag. The weight of all that water, the trapped sediment, the dam itself was enormous, estimated at over 50 billion tons. The result was a series of earthquakes in a region not known for seismic activity. The largest quake was measured in 1939 at 5.0 on the Richter scale. It caused rocks to fall across the desert, send up ominous plumes of dust. Now, in hindsight, the bedrock around Hoover Dam was more fractured than previously realized. And this situation was underscored when the dam started leaking from the bottom up. During construction, cement paste had been used to plug any underground cracks and voids. This was called a grout curtain. Hoover Dam was the first to deploy one of such magnitude, and it was poorly executed at that. Water began to fill the lower passageways of the structure. The drain system was overwhelmed, and operators had to dispatch bucket bridges. The problem was kept secret for years. Cramped workers squeezed into tight spaces to do their work. They drilled inside the depths, discovering huge cavities that would lead to eventual collapse. And a shocking amount of cement was pumped in to fill these holes. And sometimes, in the pumping of the cement, workers were caught by the incoming cement, and they died there. Once the interior was secured, new problems arose in the canyon. In 1941, Hoover Dam's massive spillways were tested for the first time. Dam operators allowed the reservoir level to rise until the water poured into the concrete-lined tunnels that had been blasted through the surrounding cliffs. And below the dam, white jets of aerated water would erupt from the outlets. After the test, inspectors found the walls of the spillway tunnels were torn to shreds and gouged by the thunderous flows. Major repairs are completed, but the tunnels went untested for another 40 years. July 1983 saw record flooding throughout the Colorado River Basin, and by now another dam had been built upstream in Glen Canyon. But due to poor planning by the Bureau of Reclamation, both reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, were too full to contain the flood. So the surging water was directed into Glen Canyon Dam's bedrock spillways, and the soft Navajo sandstone began to disintegrate from the inside out, which threatened to collapse the cliff face and the dam. If that had happened, a catastrophic wall of water would have rushed downstream at 20 miles an hour, scouring the bottom of the Grand Canyon, rushing across Lake Mead and overtopping or collapsing the Hoover Dam. Fortunately, Glen Canyon Dam was saved at the last minute. With the spillways at risk of collapsing, the reservoir operators needed to somehow increase the capacity of the reservoir. In the end, what might have been one of the worst disasters in U.S. history was prevented with the same materials found at a local hardware store. Their jury-rigged solution was to raise the height of the dam by lining the top with plywood panels. Well, Hoover Dam, of course, is found within Lake Mead National Recreation Area, located less than an hour from Las Vegas. The massive NPS unit covers about 2,300 square miles of reservoir and river and mountains and desert, operated by the Bureau of Reclamation, which charges a fee for guided tours. Otherwise, accessing the visitor center and walking or driving across the dam is free, and we've done it several times. It averages about 7 million annual visitors a year, most visited dam in the world. And Lake Mead is the largest recreation area in the national park system and one of the most popular. Due to declining reservoir levels, annual visitation decreased from a peak of about 8 million in 2020 to below 6 million in recent years. Now, of course, these numbers may rebound should the reservoir refill. Most people focus on motorboating and water skiing and fishing on the vast reservoir. Well, the flood surge was still coming for the overfilled Lake Mead. Once again, water poured into the great spillways of Hoover Dam, and once again it ripped them to pieces. And this time, the high waters continued downstream toward newly built towns and homes. Residents had moved into the floodplain, which was deemed safe after false promises of flood prevention. As these waters receded from the communities, the destruction led to a revelation. Large dams like Hoover could prevent small floods, but not the big ones. Spillways of Glen Canyon and Hoover were rebuilt, this time with better understanding of the phenomenon of turbulent cavitation. People would have to wait for future floods to see if the dams actually would hold, though. In the meantime, following decades saw an inverse situation. A prolonged drought descended on the sprawling Colorado River basin. Lake Mead dropped to record low. Numerous politicians had touted the dam and the reservoirs, along with a distribution agreement called the Colorado River Compact, as solving water conflicts among the 7 states within the Colorado River basin. Instead, the region will see the water grabs and restrictions and lawsuits that will continue for decades with little resolution. Well, clearly Hoover Dam hadn't kept the lofty promises made on its behalf. In fact, early impressions of its reliability as a water source have been due to chance. First half of the 20th century just happened to see several wet decades. And after courting a population boom it no longer could sustain, Hoover Dam now was subject to the cyclical droughts that were common throughout the American West. In the mid-1980s, a country music supergroup of 4 stars collaborated on a chart-topping single titled Highwayman. The song told a story in 4 verses about a daring soul who repeatedly reincarnated. Willie Nelson was the first of the 4 singers, singing about the original highwayman, a stagecoach robber hung for his crime in 1825. Then Chris Christopherson told about a sailor killed during a storm in the Pacific. Johnny Cash sang the finale about an astronaut who perished among the stars. That 3rd story was sung by Waylon Jennings, about a dam builder who fell into wet concrete during construction and was left to forever haunt the wild Colorado. It was the latest iteration of a persistent rumor that bodies of fallen workers remained entombed deep inside Hoover Dam. Yeah, workers had died during the construction in the 20s and 30s, and this was never in question. Some claim there was a disturbingly high number of fatalities, but precisely how many deaths would be a lingering debate for decades to come. Whatever may be your belief, the murmurs were true. There were bodies buried inside Hoover Dam. Well, critics have long talked about the Colorado River as being too thick to drink and too thin to plow. This famous river started as a tumbling stream in the Rocky Mountains, gaining volume and sediment from tributaries while meandering through a series of red rock gorges. After plunging through the rapids of Grand Canyon, it became a muddy watercourse, rolling through a barren country of cactus and Joshua trees. Well, since the late 19th century, there's been talk about building the dam to tame that mighty river. Vast reservoir would allow the silt to settle out and leave clear water for the taking. Well, by the 1920s, of course, words were turned into action. The Colorado's 1,450-mile length, a logical target was the lower gorges that were closest to the booming cities and vast farms of Southern California. Well, the first death typically attributed to the Boulder Canyon project was a government surveyor. He was scouting possible sites. This was December 20th, 1922. George Tierney's boat bucked into turbulent waters, threw him into the river where he drowned. The man's name would become a morbid bookend for a disaster-filled endeavor. 9 years later, in April of 1931, a consortium called 6 companies began construction at Black Canyon. No-nonsense foreman was Frank Crow, the most experienced dam builder in the nation. Almost immediately, accidents began to happen. Early efforts involved building roads and railways into the narrow gorge to transport workers and equipment. Dynamite was used to blast the rocky slopes, often without checking to see who might be below. Most victims in the fall zone escaped with minor injuries, while unfortunate ones were grotesquely maimed or killed. Other times, the destabilized cliffs would collapse and the workers below were crushed to death under piles of rubble. And in many cases, nobody had any idea who was there. You have to remember, this was coming off of the Great Depression, and folks were just happy to have jobs. So there was an influx of unskilled workers who wanted whatever jobs they could get. Well, summer, an intense heat wave came to the Mojave Desert, and the dam site averaged daily highs of about 120 degrees. While the nearby company town of Boulder City was being built, 6 companies had erected a temporary riverside camp for workers near cliffs at the head of the Black Canyon. Exposed to the sun and blocked from the breezes, it was a stifling location with nighttime lows rarely dropping below 90 degrees. In fact, 16 people died from overheating, at least 16 that we know about. Adding insult to the ongoing injuries, in August of 1931, 6 companies made pay cuts between 10 and 25%, depending on the job. This was the Great Depression, you know, and a steady supply of desperate laborers were arriving daily in Las Vegas. Those already among the workforce of 1,400 weren't pleased about the newcomers. When organizers from the labor union Industrial Workers of the World arrived, these so-called Wobblies organized a strike of 600 folks. 6 companies responded with a lockout and a shutdown, which the Hoover administration supported. Ultimately, the strikers were evicted from the site, and the rest were rehired along with new recruits, and 6 companies was emboldened to continue its dehumanizing practices. Well, with the arrival of fall came cooler temperatures and new challenges. An acrobatic team called High Scalers took to the canyon walls. They rappelled with ropes using jackhammers and drilled and dynamite to remove loose rock. A lot of them were Apaches, the only Native Americans employed on the project. Their goal was to groom the surface for the eventual dam. And sometimes one of them was knocked free by falling debris, and more than once a falling worker was saved when they were caught midway in the fall by another high scaler. Occasionally it was the high scaler who fell to his death. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the canyon, tunnel excavation began. One of the greatest challenges was diverting the river from its channel so that the dam could rise. And to do this, 4 massive diversion tunnels, each one over 50 feet in diameter, were blasted through the cliffs. The primary method involved what became known as a jumbo, a 3-story drilling rig mounted on a truck. Once the dynamite was placed, the jumbo drove men to safety before the charges were detonated. Hopefully. But as tunnel construction progressed deeper inside solid rock, the workers began to suffer from headaches and nausea and dizziness. In fact, some folks just fell to the ground unconscious and had to be taken to the hospital. Well, it was determined that the reasons for this was, once again, the indifference of 6 companies. Most deep shaft mining operations in the area used electric vehicles to avoid a buildup of dangerous carbon monoxide fumes. Well, to get the largest government contract ever awarded, the 6 companies had bid low. Then they cut corners at every opportunity to try to extract any profit they could find. By using cheaper gasoline-powered trucks, they saved about $300,000. The cost to the workers was carbon monoxide poisoning. A lot of those stricken never revived. Well, to avoid paying worker compensation, 6 companies concealed the tunnel deaths by listing them as natural causes like pneumonia and heart failure. Then their public relations team went to work. Construction project of this magnitude had never been attempted before, they claimed, and fatalities were unavoidable. The men were unaccustomed to the rigors of such work, especially in the inhospitable desert. In reality, these motivated workers were more than capable, but theirs was a tricky situation. Having any work during the Great Depression, let alone a job on the biggest project in American history, was simply a godsend. Risking one's life for steady pay was far better than standing in bread lines and living in shantytowns. Not only did the men accept the challenges, they seemed exhilarated by the dangers. Attitude of bravado and competitiveness spread. Work crews regularly raced each other to complete tasks. In fact, the dam site had become a tourist attraction. Death-defying workers, especially the daredevil high-scalers, were the project's heroic stars, and folks came just to watch them. Not praying that people would fall, but if somebody fell, they wanted to be there to see it. Still, resentment about lax safety regulations and uncaring management boiled up at times. When some workers filed lawsuits alleging negligence, 6 companies' response including denial, legal maneuvering, and even a conspiracy. They arranged for false witnesses to slander the injured. They bribed the juries, and people looked the other way, and all signs pointed to one inevitable outcome. Everybody in America, from endangered workers to unmoved judges to distant civilians reading the papers, wanted this dam to be built more than anything. So it was going to be built, no matter the repercussions. Well, during June of 1933, the dam began to rise. By now, the river had been diverted into the tunnels, and FDR was in the White House. The new Interior Secretary had briefly looked into improving conditions at the construction site, but due to contracts and politics, very little changed. It was business as usual for the final push to completion. Overhead, huge cableways lowered heavy buckets, and each dropped 16 tons of concrete into wooden forms, typically 50 by 50 foot squares. Overall, the dam would comprise 230 of these interlocking columns. And after the wet concrete plopped out, it was spread with shovels by workers wearing rubber boots. Each bucket load covered about an inch of the form. Temperatures and strain sensors were buried by hand for future monitoring. With every 5 feet gained in height, the pipe were laid down to circulate cold water. This theoretically would regulate the curing of the concrete, which otherwise would expand from internal heating. Well, with new methods of doing business came new dangers. Occasionally, a crack like a gunshot would echo through the canyon as an overhead cable snapped, and a massive concrete bucket might plummet from above, sometimes bouncing off the form and falling toward the riverbed. Several workers were crushed to death or knocked from the rising columns. A few times, workers were buried in wet cement, but not within the dam itself. During a night shift, a full bucket tumbled over the edge of the form and somehow ensnared a signalman and carried him down the upstream face. Workers searched the scaffolding below, but initially found nothing. Then a dim light was spotted flickering midway down. The signalman was found lying on his back, partially covered and slowly setting the cement. One of his hands held up a lit match. Rescuers hurriedly clawed away to the cement, and somehow he survived, which in and of itself was a miracle. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, which surrounds Lake Powell, is located on the Colorado River in the high desert of Arizona and Utah. And given its remote location and shorter summer season, this NPS unit has historically seen about half the visitation of Lake Mead, though the difference has decreased in recent years. And the building of Glen Canyon Dam in 1966 remains highly controversial for several reasons. The creation of Lake Powell flooded a wilderness canyon considered comparable in beauty to those found downstreams in the Grand Canyon National Park, upstreams in Canyonlands National Park. Not only is the dam built into friable Navajo sandstone, but the reservoir behind it only reached full capacity for a few years during the early 1980s, when a lot of observers believed it became close to collapsing. Meanwhile, an unknown but growing amount of sediment is dispersing toward the northern end of the reservoir, where the remnants of the ill-planned Haight Marina rest high and dry, a half-mile uphill from the current channel. Well, due to these controversies, a lot of Western environmentalists entirely avoid what some label Reservoir Powell, which has become to be known mostly for motorboating and houseboating and lake fishing. Other travelers recognize the vast opportunities for outdoor recreation. Paddlers can explore side canyons in the Colorado River downstream of the dam. Road trippers grab selfies at the iconic Horseshoe Bend. Hikers follow trails leading through slot canyons and rock formations. History buffs wander through ghost towns and Old West ranches, including sites such as Lee's Ferry, the famous launching point for river trips through the Grand Canyon. When it comes to controversial places, the oldest cinematic recreation area in the scorched desert near Page, Arizona certainly qualifies. There was another victim of what might be considered poor planning, who wasn't so lucky when a 5-foot wall of a wooden form broke. Wet cement and large cobblestones tumbled down the dam face, gathered pipes and scaffolding as it fell. And standing on the ground, a worker was flattened by the rubble pile. Took nearly a full day to extract his buried body. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the impact. Hoover Dam was completed about 2 years ahead of schedule. In 1835, over 3.5 million cubic yards of concrete had been poured. The result was a hybrid gravity-arched dam, 660 feet thick at its base, which tapered to a curved top about 45 feet wide. It was literally the tallest dam in the world. Distinction it held for over 20 years before being surpassed by one in the Swiss Alps. 3 months after FDR's dedication speech, an infamous fatality occurred to be officially declared the last of the project. While working on an intake tower, an electrician named Patrick Tierney fell to his death. Happened December 20th, 1935, and it was 13 years to the day after his father, Surveyor George Tierney, had drowned in the Colorado River. But in reality, at least one convenient exclusion was required to concoct that morbid legend that a father and son bookend the construction fatalities at Hoover Dam. Now, George Tierney wasn't the first, but the second project fatality. Another surveyor drowned in 1921, a year before his father. Meanwhile, about 2 months after the son died, construction was declared to be complete when 6 companies transferred management of the dam site to the Bureau of Reclamation. But major work continued on the powerhouse till the generators were activated between late 1936 and 1938. Any injuries or fatalities during that time are likely categorized as operational casualties and appear lost to history. A memorial was erected on the dam crest to honor the workers who lost their lives to make the desert bloom. The official number of total fatalities was reported as 96. But this sub-100 number doesn't include at least 16 deaths from heat exposure. It didn't include any of the 86 deaths categorized as from natural causes, some of which were likely to have been carbon monoxide poisoning. Official tally also excluded those who were injured on the dam project but who died in the hospital. But one thing was certain, no bodies had been buried inside Hoover Dam itself, at least it was never admitted. This would have created a dangerous void in the concrete that would lead to collapse. Plus, the methodical approach of spreading concrete a few inches at a time entirely precluded that possibility, according to the 6 companies. There's no mystery that countless lives were lost. The truth of what happened to those workers has been buried not by concrete, but by indifference and deception and technicalities and paperwork. Now, the real mystery was more sinister. In fact, nobody will ever know how many people died in the building of Hoover Dam. Well, there's been a lot of stories and legends that have grown up around the dam. During one trip we made, I got into a conversation with one of the, I guess you can call them caretakers. They wandered through the parking lot and make sure that everybody gets away okay. But he was talking about spirits that had been seen. And he made the comment that there had been far more dead than was ever admitted. And on that note, before we started a new topic, We come to the end of today's show. Only got a few minutes left. So until tomorrow at this time, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.